The Capital BlueCross Forum is sponsored in part by Capital BlueCross.
Good afternoon. I'm Doug Furness, and welcome to this episode of the Public Affairs Forum, sponsored by Capital BlueCross. Capital BlueCross is a regional Blue Cross plan serving approximately 800,000 members in central Pennsylvania and the Lehigh Valley. I want to thank our longtime partner in these broadcasts, PCN, for their commitment to the program and the relationship they have with Capital BlueCross. We look forward to continuing our relationship for many years to come. Our format remains the same. Our guests will make a presentation, followed by a question and answer session moderated by me. If you're on the live webinar and wish to ask a question of our guest, please submit it through the chat function. The whole program will last about an hour. I'm excited about today's program. He happens to be a friend, and I appreciate his agreeing to do this for us. Our guest today is House Majority Leader Matt Bradford, who represents the residents of the 70th Legislative District in the Pennsylvania House. For nearly 20 years, Matt Bradford has been fighting for hardworking families in Montgomery County. Matt was first elected to serve the state as state representative of the 70th District in 2009. From 2019 through 2023, he served as the Democratic chairman of the House Appropriations Committee. And most recently, he's been chosen by his colleagues to lead the House Democratic Caucus as Majority Leader. Matt earned both his undergraduate and law degrees from Villanova University and is a lifelong resident of southeastern Pennsylvania. Matt's an avid Philadelphia sports fan. He lives in Worcester Township with his wife, Renee, and their 4 children. Please welcome Matt Bradford.
Thank you, Doug. Thank you for having me. I do appreciate the opportunity. You would think 3 or 4 years after the pandemic, I'd have perfected Zoom, but I do appreciate you having me today, and I apologize for the technical difficulties. But I'm really happy to be here and appreciate your friendship, and you're always making yourself available to talk about issues, obviously, regarding your industry, but frankly, just about what's going on in the Capitol and the issues that are important. And I appreciate the very kind introduction. It was probably too kind. But obviously, it's been a heck of a year since the House Democrats took the majority. And I'm glad to fill you in a little bit about what we've been able to accomplish. But really, more importantly, as we go back into session next week, what is still on the table and what the governor has challenged us, and I think rightfully so, and in some ways inspired us to do the work ahead. There's so much that we need to do to make Pennsylvania a more competitive state and to do really the work in front of us. You were kind in your introduction to mention my southeastern roots and most importantly, my Villanova roots, but my southeastern roots. And so much of what I talk about, I think, comes from what I've seen in the Commonwealth, but also what I've seen back home, the issues that I think are important. One of those most importantly, especially as I speak to largely a business crowd, is competitiveness. And, I think for too long, Democrats abdicated its role in having this conversation about how we make Pennsylvania a more competitive alternative and really tell the story about why Pennsylvania is successful. And I think I see that here in my backyard in suburban Montgomery County, but really through southeastern Pennsylvania and in different pockets across this Commonwealth about what we can do to attract the type of businesses, the types of jobs, the kind of workforce that wants to come in to serve those jobs, that wants those high-paying jobs. And to me, that begins a lot with what informs what I believe our legislative majority needs to be talking about, which is strong public schools, strong infrastructure, and a quality of life that comes with that. So, obviously we've talked a lot about the issue of public education, making sure that every kid has the constitutionally guaranteed right to the best type of public education possible. I think so much of what we need to do here in Pennsylvania is make sure that every child, every future worker, every future member of our tax base is given that constitutionally guaranteed right. And I'd also argue that when we fail to do that, and what we've done to certain communities in terms of a property tax rate that frankly is too high to have the type of community that we would want, I think we do a disservice not just to that child, but to that community and to the long-term to the workforce that we need to build for the future to be more competitive. I also mentioned infrastructure, just in terms of things like SEPTA funding, which I know is important right now in southeastern Pennsylvania, but this is going to play a role across the Commonwealth, and we need to talk about what we're going to do to address these issues, how we continue to get goods and services to market, how we get a workforce to those places where we have business growth and opportunity. So I think that's another issue that we need to talk about, and we need to be getting on that forthwith. And then I talk about the quality of life issues, and I think our caucus has talked a good bit about that in terms of everything from the challenges we're having in some of our cities right now around crime and attacking that. Governor Shapiro, former Attorney General, obviously has taken a very strong and robust stand. I think he's right to do that. I think we need to make sure that our cities, we all recall the days before pandemic where so many of our young people were moving into the cities. A lot of our empty nesters were moving back in. And I say cities, but really our walkable communities, our third-class cities. Where I am in southeastern Pennsylvania, where a lot of you are in the capital region, whether it's Derry Township or Swarthmore or Ambler, these communities are thriving because that's the type of community and strong schools and lifestyle people want. So I think we need to do more to embrace that, and we need to embrace the business and corporate community that makes that possible. In my backyard, that looks a lot like pharmaceuticals, but in reality, in the western part of the state, with what the great work they're doing at Pitt and CMU, it's around automation and such. And so we need to embrace both regional strengths in other parts of the Commonwealth. It's built largely around energy and those opportunities. And we shouldn't shirk away from those based on some preconceived notion of what the future economy of our Commonwealth is. We need to push forward on all of these. And I think the governor has shown us a way forward. I think we've done some really important things in that regard. But at the same time, we would be remiss if we didn't talk about who's at the center of this, which is the middle class from which we build all this, hopefully, growth out and what we need to do. So I talk about, making a tax climate better. House Democrats are really proud. Last session, we passed really historic C&I acceleration reform, net operating loss reform, to encourage those types of businesses and corporations to come to Pennsylvania, to stay in Pennsylvania, most importantly, to grow in Pennsylvania. We've done that, but we also need to make sure that our friends that we do right by not just the workers, but that workforce. We were proud in the House 18 months ago to sponsor a child independent care tax credit to make child care more affordable. And not only to pass it last year, but in this year's budget, starting actually in this April's tax return, people are going to see a threefold increase in the child care tax credit. That is just huge for middle class working families in every corner of Pennsylvania. And it's not just for our poorest families, though rightfully it targets those most in need. But this will allow middle class, working class, white collar and blue collar workers alike to take advantage. So these are a time of tremendous opportunity. We also showed that we could do that at a time where we have divided government. Obviously, we've got a House Democratic majority, but as I like to say, it's a pretty modest majority. It's a majority of one. It's a pragmatic majority. But working with a Senate Republican majority and a Democratic governor, we were able to piece together the votes. Maybe it took us a little longer than we would have liked to, but we showed what a pro-business, pro-worker, pro-growth competitive agenda could look like. So I think that's something that we're proud of last year. But again, there's a lot of those, and the governor rightfully calls them unfinished business, as we now pivot into this year's session before the June 30th deadline. And we know there's elections in November, and we would be naive not to recognize they're on the horizon. But we need to check off some of that unfinished business. Everything from a myriad of things, from making sure that we're not the last northeastern state still paying a minimum wage of $7.25 an hour, which is just an immoral, unconscionable thing. The House was proud last session that we sent over a minimum wage path to $15 an hour. We're waiting to hear what our Senate Republican colleagues and friends are going to send us back. Many of them have paid lip service to their desire to see a meaningful wage to be paid here in the Commonwealth, and we look forward to joining that conversation. There's other things that aren't just in the pure economic space. There's everything from statute of limitations reform to make sure that those who are the victims of past sexual abuse are made sure that they are given an opportunity at justice in our civil courts. So we want to make sure we get that over the finish line. And now, as we move forward, we want to make sure we pass some important legislation in the area of the environment, in terms of public safety, and we look forward to working with our Republican friends. Again, we'd be the first to concede we don't have a monopoly on good ideas, and we want to patch together a bipartisan legislative record over the next few months that Pennsylvanians can be proud of and builds on the steps that I talked about last year. Again, I think there's more to be done. I mentioned a pretty ambitious tax package we sent over. We look forward again to hearing from our Senate Republican colleagues what they want to do. And then there's a myriad of issues, everything from what the marijuana space will look like, as so many of our surrounding states have gone to a full legalization regime. We're going to have to do something there. There's also the issue of the skilled games, as they're called, and what that's going to look like. Again, we're going to look forward to seeing what our Senate Republican friends can pass over. Again, I don't want to sound like we're putting everything on the wait and see of our Senate Republican friends, but they, in a bicameral legislative situation with divided government, we do have to see what they're comfortable with and what they can move. But I think we've set ourselves up with a pretty darn dynamic governor who's put out a pretty ambitious budget, who's got sky high poll numbers, who's kind of testing this legislature and saying, let's see what you guys can do on the unfinished business, on the tough challenges in front of us. We want to make sure we move on education, on infrastructure, on economic competitiveness and growth, everything from minimum wage. So there's so many opportunities. I look forward, Doug, to taking any questions you have, and really look forward to having a conversation about how we can make Pennsylvania not only more competitive, but more livable, more affordable, and really reinforce those strengths that I mentioned that we have here in the Commonwealth, and make sure we can build for that for the good of every Pennsylvania citizen.
Outstanding. You gave us a lot to digest. And hopefully you can take a deep breath and we'll just have a nice little conversation. Before we start, I have to say, I can't believe it's been 2009 since we first met. I mean, that seems like yesterday, but it has been a while. My first question to you is, how is the legislature the same, and how is it different since you started?
I don't want to harp on the negative, but obviously the amount of partisanship has really gotten to an unhealthy amount. I'm not telling you anything you don't know. We see it in the dysfunction that we've known has existed in Washington, D.C. Unfortunately, that has trickled down into the state level. Frankly, the pure, I don't want to sound hyperbolic, but the pure poison into the body politic after the 2020 election, that was really a low point for many of us. I always say, as someone who ran a couple tough elections in my life and fully expected to lose a couple of them, you just assume at 8 o'clock, you win or lose, you shake the other guy's or gal's hand and you wish them well. That's at the bedrock principle of our democratic ideals and what we all hold ourselves to. When you start pulling at the threads of that, you kind of leave a bruise. And I think that is a not so great legacy of the former president. But that's also, it did some damage in our legislature because some people engaged in that, what I would call an unhealthy way. So there's some bad feelings even 4 years after that. But again, there's also some things from 2009 that are very similar. Those relationships, the relationships are where it's at in so many things. The legislature is no different than Main Street or corporate America. Relationships make all the difference. Sometimes that ability to connect on a personal level, those long-standing knowing something about somebody or what they care about or what their interests are, those relationships can get you through those rough patches. I'm one who recognizes that Zoom and our reliance on it, frankly. And we had two successive incoming classes, major classes, huge classes, Democrat and Republican in the legislature, who didn't have that bonding opportunity of that, in-person orientation, that first week of session, that, first time in hearings. We got away from that. It's an obligation from those of us who are now more senior members, if only because we're the ones who held out the longest, to kind of rebuild that. I always jokingly say my favorite day of the legislative year is the legislative softball game. Getting back to some level of civility, to kind of ignore the loudest, screechiest, shrillest voices of partisanship, and recognize whether it's our common humanity, our love of our kids, our communities. What separates us is small compared to what should unite us. It sounds trite to say, but it is true. We need to get back to that. We need to reinforce that. We need leaders who will do that. And we need leaders who will lead, who will just tune out the hyper partisan view. I'm a proud progressive Democrat, but I believe in the system. I believe in the Commonwealth. I believe in getting the deal done and progress. And too many folks have allowed the hyper partisanship and all that poison to be an excuse for government not to work. And I would argue, and maybe I'm belaboring the point, that it's that inability from government to move on from that carnage to start to heal those wounds. When government works, when we sit down and we do something like a dependent care tax credit, we get a budget done that has historic increases in education. I think we can put some of that in the rearview mirror and start talking about the future and the good things that are still to be done.
Outstanding, and we wish you luck. I know everybody on the call wishes you luck in those endeavors. Absolutely. Before we get down into the policy stuff, I think a lot of the folks on the call would be interested to know who Matt Bradford is. So tell us a little bit about your background. Why did you decide to get involved in public service? And do you have a mentor? I always like to ask folks, do they have a mentor in this? And just to give folks an idea of what makes you tick.
So what makes me tick more than anything, anyone who knows me, is love of sports and watching my kids play those sports. So I'm probably too simple in some ways. I say loyalty is very important to me, and loyalty meaning the Phillies, the Flyers, the Sixers, the Eagles, and the three-time national champion Villanova Wildcats. I'm very predictable, for lack of a better word, and I'm a total homer. And watching my kids play the sports that I grew up loving makes me happy, and that is what when I'm not working, that's what I do, and it brings great joy, and it probably more than anything defines who I am. It's my office jokingly, even that Stephen Caruso, I believe. I didn't realize suburban dad has a connotation to it, but they've decided that is my MO. But that is just who I am. Mentor is interesting. I once had, I don't think I've ever been asked that question. I remember I think it was 8th grade, it may have been 9th grade history teacher, Mr. Meischt, who, I think for many of us, he kind of was just the guy who knew I was one of those, I love sports, all that. But my quiet nerdiness was that I loved everything government and history, and still do to this day. And I think he recognized that in me. And so we would have these strange conversations about what was going on in the world of politics and government. And he knew he was also a basketball coach. So he could talk about my two loves and passions simultaneously. And, I always thought, my interest in politics is no different. I love my team, but, I love the game, and I love the game more, and the outcome and the process. And, my college roommate is another person who I kind of consider my North Star, good Republican through and through. But me and him have always had the best conversations, and I can't say it's a mentor relationship. But I'm very strong in my own ideas, but I'm not foolish enough to believe that they're always the right ideas. And I love to hear someone who I respect and have the highest admiration for and affection give me a different side of things. And I think we we don't have enough of that. So I think that's a good sounding board for what's going through my mind.
Okay, very good, very good. Curious, people in your position, there was generally a reason or something that pushed you over the edge. Why did you run? What were the issues that you were passionate about? Maybe still are, that you're still advocating on that incentivized you to run for public office?
So, I touched on it already in the conversation I had, which is, support for public education. It is something that I just believe so strongly. Listen, again, I probably already said I'm a progressive Democrat once, but to me, that means, you support a program, you want to solve problems, you believe government can be part of the solution. But I'd be the first one to concede. A lot of those programs, a lot of those challenges are very hard to overcome the damage. The damage that I would argue is largely caused by the failure of a strong public education. I think the best thing government can do, maybe the only thing government can get right from job one, and frankly, not something that we should all realize, this is the best early investment we can make. Everything else is about trying to fix a problem. Education is about that early investment to give that kid that fair chance. And whether in the wealthy school district, a poor school district, a minority school district, a suburban school district, or rural school district, I just tend to believe that the best thing government can do is get that right. In my prior life, I was an attorney. I actually represented one of our local school districts, and seeing just how the adequacies and inadequacies, and I say in kind of my stump speech, these township line roads that exist across the Commonwealth, the discrepancy and opportunity that exists in Montgomery County just between Lower Merion and our neighbor to the east in the Philadelphia school district. These are bordering school districts. I don't think people realize that. Or even in my backyard between the Methacton school district, which is an amazing public school where my 4 kids go to school, but the neighboring Norristown school district. And not just the opportunity of those kids, but the impact on those communities in terms of disparate tax impacts, home values, just how so much of it is informed by that. So the biggest issue that brought me to the legislature, keeps me in the legislature, and frankly, I guess I'm lucky in this regard, I think largely illuminates and energizes my caucus, is the fight to make sure that every kid gets the educational opportunity they deserve, whichever school district they live in.
Outstanding. And that is a great segue into my next question, having to do with education. I mean, there's a lot we can really get into the weeds, but right now that the Commonwealth is working on a fair funding structure so that all school districts are, air quotes, fairly funded. I wonder if you could explain that to people on the call, just in its basics. What does that mean? Because folks, they live in their school district, they pay their property taxes, their kids go to those schools, but they don't understand what's going on in the other 499 school districts in the state. So what are we trying to do here, and what might it mean for them?
So it's a great question, and I'm not going to get the numbers exactly right, but let me give you a kind of a ballpark of what it means. The inequities that exist in Pennsylvania, and what it means. Weighted student is a term we use to say, kind of the average student based on what exists in that school district and with the student body, everything from special ed to English language learner to, deep poverty, all those things that drive costs. To put in comparison, a Reading school district is probably funding per pupil spending in the high $6,000 amount per student. If I told you that number is about 3.5 times higher in the Lower Merion school district, or 2.5, almost 3 times higher in the school district my kids go to, the idea that we're going to say that we're giving equal opportunity to every one of those kids, when the discrepancy, the inequity of that funding is so blown out in those districts. Now, again, dollars alone are never going to educate a child. And we need to talk about accountability. We need to talk about standards. We need to talk about communities and parents. And we need to talk about pre-K and universal kindergarten. We maybe need to be talking about a longer school day and a longer school year. I mean, we need to talk about things that are going to make everyone have to come to the table. And let's be clear, no one side, region, teacher, union, administrator, community is going to love all of it. But the idea that we are going to, generation out after generation, provide children a level of education in terms of funding, and frankly, if we're being honest, stigmatizing their communities because the quality of the education is viewed as inferior, stigmatize that community and that child's education. We have some work to do, and that isn't, the Democratic House leader saying that. That was a Republican elected Commonwealth Court judge. Now, again, we don't have Republican judges, but to give you some insight, this isn't a Democrat or Republican issue. I would argue it's a moral issue, but it's gotten so blown out, as the example I showed you between Reading and Lower Merion, that it rises to the level of being a constitutional violation. So it is incumbent upon all of us to deal with this issue. Not next budget, this budget. We made tremendous steps in Governor Shapiro's first budget in terms of historic increase in education. But we need to make sure that these dollars are driven out by an equity formula that makes sure that we address specifically those districts that are habitually, generationally underfunded.
Outstanding. And it leads me to a follow-up question. It's probably a little more of an uncomfortable question. It has to do with the governor's tuition voucher, tuition scholarship program that he advocated last year that didn't pass. I'm curious. I mean, what I'm hearing from you, you're a very strong advocate on public schools. What does a voucher program, what's the problem with it? What are some advantages, if there are any?
So let me say this. We already have an EITC program, and we also have an OSTC program. One of the things that I have always been blown away by, and for those who know, EITC is a tax credit program specifically to allow, frankly, middle-class kids to go to the private school of their choice using what is not necessarily state dollars, but is tax credits raised in lieu of state tax dollars. We also have an OSTC program, which specifically targets poor kids in poor schools. House Democrats, and I speak for myself, but I think I speak for every member of our caucus when I say this. When it comes to poor kids in poor schools, House Democrats have been waiting for this fight. Frankly, not even this fight, this discussion, for as long as many of us have been in the legislature. I mentioned that it's what brought me to the legislature. It's what keeps so many of our members in the legislature. And having represented both some of the wealthiest schools in Montgomery County and some of the poorest, and having a caucus that represents both some of the wealthiest and some of the poorest school districts. We don't just represent some of those schools that are most challenged. In many cases, many of my colleagues in the House Democratic Caucus, our kids attend those schools. So when the governor says he wants to talk about a voucher program for poor kids in poor schools, I don't love vouchers, period, full stop. I think our number one priority needs to be funding public education and make sure every public school, which is the backstop and the constitutional right of every child, is strong. But I've said we are more than open to have a discussion about how we can target alternatives for poor kids in poor schools. And that's not, I hope no one says, oh, that's a political wiggle term. No, it's sincere. When we said to the governor, we will have a discussion about what he's proposing, what's already existing in terms of EITC and OSTC. And if they want to have, and I say this with all respect to my Senate Republican friends, if they are concerned as we are about poor kids in poor schools, this is the right opportunity when our coffers are flush, when the discussion is ripe, when you have a Democratic governor who's clearly, and to his credit, is willing to look outside the box. And I think you will find a House Democratic leader and leadership, as well as membership, that is pragmatic and is concerned about these issues and is willing to have a discussion. But what I'll say to them is they better also get out of their lane and be as willing to break with Republican orthodoxy, which is why for 40 years we haven't funded these public schools and the disinvestment that came with that.
Very good. Very good. Thank you. You gave me a bunch of notes in your opening presentation that I want to talk to you about. And the first one is competitiveness. And I've had some of your colleagues on from different parts of the state and in different chambers. I've had the Senate Majority Appropriations Chairman on this program and asking the same question I'm going to ask you now. We talk about competitiveness, and and we talk about how do we keep kids home, how do we incentivize people to come, and all of that. The reality, though, is that competitiveness is uneven in this state, right? I mean, your part of the world, Montgomery County and Lancaster County, or Senator Martin, they're exploding in growth. Their opportunities abound. Even in much of the mid-state, the same is true. The question, though, is that's not true in large portions of the rest of the state. Why? And what are you guys doing right down there that, let's say, in the northern tier or in the Southwest, I don't want to say that they're not doing right or that isn't working to the same level. So why such a different story about competitiveness in this state?
I think that's a great question. I think it's actually fundamental to so much of what we talk about. And sometimes while we've got a Senate Republican leadership that's much more Western and rural, and a Democratic leadership that's much more suburban and Eastern, it sometimes seems like we're talking past each other. And I'm so glad you raised that, because this is something I've actually given some thought about. And I can't say I've got the answers, but I definitely have some thoughts on it. Part of it's demographics, obviously, right? A lot of those areas, people are moving places that are warmer, different. But the reality is it's not any warmer in Montgomery County than it is in than Perry County, right? I would argue it's also about policy. Um, as a Commonwealth, we have a demographic problem. I believe these folks were sold a little bit of a bill of goods for the last 20 years. First, it was, go all in on fracking, energy alone will solve it. And I think sometimes our folks put out a counter narrative of, oh, that's all bad. Listen, the reality is it's no one thing. It's everything. You need young people and you need that next generation to stay and invest. Especially now, thanks to Zoom, good or bad, people can work from anywhere they want in many cases. We need to create a tax climate. And I think they were sold a bill of goods when they said, well, if you just, shrink government as much as possible, keep your minimum wage as low as possible, you can kind of what I call win the race to the bottom. What I would argue in southeastern Pennsylvania is we've got higher wages as a rule. In some cases, we probably actually have higher school taxes in many cases. People don't flee our area because of those things. I would argue in many cases because we have the best public schools, because we've got the amenities, because we've invested in quality of life, infrastructure, public transit, the amenities that come with all those things. People want those things now more than ever. I talk about the walkable neighborhoods. It's why people want to live in Camp Hill. It's why people want to live in Westchester. It's why, we see the growth of these type of communities again. People need that sense of community. They want that. You're not going to build that by telling people, and I'm trying to say this in as kind a way as possible, kind of the more conservative idea that they were going to win the battle to the race to the bottom. I don't want to win a race to the bottom where we corner the market on $7.25 an hour jobs. I don't want to corner the market on that type of work. What we need is a high skilled, high wage, high performing workforce that wants to come to communities like we have in the Capital Region, like we have in southeastern Pennsylvania, and frankly, we have in western Pennsylvania. There's parts of Allegheny County that are booming and have come out of the ashes, like the Phoenix, from where it was. There are things we have to do for rural Pennsylvania too, though, and I would argue government needs to be a partner in that, and that looks like everything from broadband, and it looks like not just broadband infrastructure, but actual physical infrastructure, transit, transportation, roads, bridges. I think my conservative friends who largely cater rural Pennsylvania are selling their people a lot of grievances in terms of national politics, but in terms of state politics, about where the rubber meets the road on policy, they have no solution at all for these folks. If these folks aren't able to connect to the internet, if they're not able to get to where the jobs and businesses are in the cities, I don't know what they're offering these folks, to be honest. So I would argue respectfully that we have a better vision and we've got a better track record than some of our more conservative friends who offer an alternative.
It's an interesting conversation, and obviously, I think you know where I live. I live in South Central PA, in a rural community that used to have, manufacturing of clothing manufacturing and some of all of those kinds of things that have left. And so the question for some of these communities is, what do you replace the legacy industries that were once there that may not come back because of the things you talk about? You don't have businesses relocating to certain parts of the world because communities may not be walkable. It may not be the scenario that their employees want. And so, what do we do for those communities?
And one of the things you mentioned, manufacturing, and one of the things, and this isn't a plug for some of the current president's policies, but when you talk about, you're right, we're not going to be able to make, to your point, dresses cheap enough. We're not going to be able to do as cheap as they can do in Southeast Asia. But I don't know if we want to win the race to making that type of manufacturing, because frankly, it's not going to provide the type of jobs that we would want. But let me tell you, I do want to win the race for semiconductors and chips and building high level manufacturing. And that's why, and listen, I'd be the first to recognize, I think my party in many ways missed the boat when my Republican friends, and I think they were right to talk about the need to create a workforce that was ready to go into the trades and these type of businesses. But as we rebuild our manufacturing base, and we need a manufacturing base, let's be clear, for our own long-term national security, but also because there are certain workers that and certain types of businesses, as we saw during the worst days of COVID, that we need to hear domestically produced, and we can produce better, especially if we have the right type of skilled workforce. So we want to draw those people here, and I think we can do that. We need to make sure our folks are skilled up to do it. I think we need to make the right infrastructure investments to do it. I think we need the right type of tax system to make ourselves competitive and attractive to that. But there's no reason in the world that these legacy communities get left behind. We need to invest in them. We need to reach out to them. I think sometimes, again, because our politics have become so much about grievance, I worry that we're not, and I say this from someone who lives in southeastern Pennsylvania, we need to reach out to these folks and say, no, your success is our success too. This isn't about like, oh, look, we're doing it right over here. You need to do it like us. It's like, no, we're all in this together. It's a commonwealth. We're all going to sink or swim together.
Outstanding. I'm going to change gears a little bit. Capital BlueCross is a healthcare company. And so all the folks that are on here, most of the folks that are on the live webinar have a vested interest in healthcare policy. I'm curious, what are the healthcare policy initiatives for the House Democrats over the next 12 to 18 months?
Healthcare initiatives?
Yes.
Yeah. So one of the biggest ones right now, and again, this isn't the blocking and tackling that I know we spend a lot of time talking about, but one of the ones that's getting the most attention right now is making sure that every Pennsylvania has the right to reproductive health care. This is an issue that I think we saw when so many folks, went around for years talking about they were going to overturn Roe versus Wade. And I don't think people realized exactly what a mess that would create in its wake. And as you're seeing states, whether it was Alabama attacking IVF treatments, obviously some states having full and partial abortion bans, I think people realize how important it is that we codify once and for all the rights that were guaranteed in Roe here in Pennsylvania to make sure every woman has that right to make those decisions. I would also argue, not to jump around, and I do want to answer the rest of your question, but you talked about competitiveness and attractiveness. I don't think people are going to want to live, frankly, in states where, God forbid, their wife has a health challenge, God forbid, their daughter needs to access reproductive health care, that they are banned from getting it. So we want to make sure we do that here in Pennsylvania. And I think that's also a competitive issue. Now, to the blocking and tackling of it, obviously, and I want to thank you publicly for your help. I know it's not been easy, but we've talked a little bit about Representative Krueger's bill on ensuring access to contraception coverage. Obviously, that is an issue. If you truly want to limit the number of safe legal abortions, you should encourage the easy access to contraceptions and contraceptives. And I think that is something that we could accomplish in this term. And I hope that working together, we're going to be able to do that. One of the things I think we also have to do is talk about support workers. I mentioned increasing the minimum wage. That sounds like just a pure, oh, that's a typical Democratic talking point. Democrat wants to increase wages, right? Well, part of it is so many of our DSPs, our frontline workers, whether it's in nursing homes, hospitals, too many of these folks aren't getting paid enough wage, especially the home workers, home care workers, to provide those services. We need to make sure that we raise the rates to allow the employers to provide those wages, but we also need to increase those wages so that those who are on the front lines providing those services, one, can provide for their own family, but two, can provide that consistent level of care that only comes with being able to afford decent transportation, their own kids' childcare. And again, by the way, why would we expect someone to take care of our mom or our sick loved one or those that are more susceptible or vulnerable because of intellectual disability or whatever, that they're going to take good care of our family, but we're not going to make sure that they're paid a wage sufficient that they can take care of theirs? It's just the right thing to do. And it's not traditional, healthcare policy. But it is what healthcare policy really is, which is taking care of people. And that's what we need to do here in the Commonwealth.
Outstanding. Just to segue into another area of healthcare, I know the governor mentioned in his budget address that he is going to seek some PBM, pharmacy benefit manager reform legislation. And you, in your comments, talked about businesses in the Southeast that are in the pharmaceutical space. I know as a health insurer, we have that balance of trying to provide quality care for our members and trying to control costs at the same time. And this is going to be a challenge. I'm curious, and obviously we're all trying to figure out how to get our hands around that, because the pharmaceutical industry its innovation has been historic. I mean, I don't know that we can look at any kind of industry and see just the life-changing innovations that the pharmaceutical industry has been able to bring to the marketplace. The challenge is that stuff's not cheap. And so, and you know that. And so how do you balance the innovation side on the pharmaceutical side versus the cost side, that in a society that still tends to provide its health insurance through employer-sponsored care? How do we balance that? Because those costs are a major driver on our end, but and you probably won't, I'm a health insurance lobbyist, so hopefully pharma's not listening to this.
Self-awareness is a strength, Doug Furness.
That's right. Okay. But the reality is what they do is life-changing stuff. But how do we do that? I'm just curious what your thoughts are.
I think you hit the nail on the head when you said it's a balance. Listen, every couple of years I joke 60 Minutes, God bless them, and they're right. But for a while it was the insurance companies. They got their moment under the bus, and the docs certainly had their moment. The PBMs seem to be the ones right now whose practices are being scrutinized. And again, all issues. When you're talking 20% of GDP, everyone's portion of the pie needs to be looked at. The best thing we can do is transparency. I think we've come a long way in terms of getting more people coverage, thanks to Obamacare and the ACA. But one thing that I think is really the unfinished business of the ACA is to further bend the curve. President Biden's talking about insulin coverage and making that more affordable. But again, it's a balance. It's making sure that we have more. And also, I mentioned transparency, but I don't think it's just a throwaway line. Sometimes I kind of, I don't want to say chuckle, but I recognize the irony of my Republican friends saying, we need to run it like a business. It's a very odd business where you can't turn down business for non-payment. It's an odd business where no one actually tells you what the price of anything is. It's a unique business. I mean, listen, America has the best healthcare in the world. It's also got the most expensive healthcare in the world. If we're going to keep the best of a private run health system, we need more transparency. We need more balance in the system. Right now, PBMs are certainly getting the examination that's probably long overdue. But again, it's a balance.
Outstanding. I will just say that as you consider those initiatives, please include Capital Blue Cross. We would like to be involved in that conversation. And I will tell the folks on the call here that there are a few people in Harrisburg I'd rather have in the room than Matt Bradford. He's a thoughtful guy and a fair guy, and so that's good news for all parties, I do believe. Transition. You've talked about infrastructure. And that's interesting. It's amazing that it's what was it last year that the president was able to accomplish historic transportation and infrastructure legislation, and it was probably what 7 years ago that the state of Pennsylvania did its own infrastructure legislation that increased our gas taxes and things like that that are paying for, roads and bridges and mass transit and things like that. I am curious. We've got in that 10-year period, we've got some, from what we do for a living, some big deal pieces of legislation. What else is out there? What else can we do? Is that enough, or is it just about pushing the money out, getting the projects on the list and completing them?
So I don't want to age you, and I certainly want to be contrarian. I would point out, actually, the Pennsylvania infrastructure bill, our transit bill, is actually over a decade ago now. I'm reminded of this. I had a meeting today, actually, with Valley Forge transit folks, and then it was Secretary Shoke called it the decade of investment. That was during the Corbett administration, just to put in perspective, over a decade ago. And it really looked at it with a 10-year horizon. And we've largely done that. Now, obviously, the President Biden's historic bipartisan infrastructure bill has brought additional federal dollars. But you mentioned what a high state gas tax we have because of how we fund transportation is what drives that, and some constitutional prohibitions that we have, which means the gas tax is what it takes to fund roads and bridges. But I would also point out that as more cars are becoming electric vehicles, that we need to look at things like vehicle miles driven as opposed to a traditional gas tax, which frankly carves out electric vehicles from paying their fair share, not in a way to dissuade people from making the transfer to less carbon producing transportation. But we need to recognize that we need to find how to raise those funds, and we're not going to do it with more fuel efficient cars that use less gas, which is all great, but it also brings in less money for the roads and bridges that we know that we pretty much, prior to the last decade when we made this investment, were put out, given low priority in terms of funding. So we need to get that part done. We need to talk about things like that, though. The vehicle miles is one of the obvious ones you see on the turnpike now, the all electronic tolling, getting rid of the gantries, those type of efficiencies that come with that. Obviously, there was for our friends who were the toll takers, that progress came at a cost, a job cost. But hopefully that will become a more efficient way to do the type of expansion we need to do. So we do need to do that part of it. But I mentioned infrastructure. It's not just roads and bridges. It's our water system. We're having these, I don't want to say fluke storms anymore, because frankly, yesterday it was 43 degrees here and we had a snowstorm and it thundered that same night. We're having more of these extreme weather I don't want to say opportunities, but experiences that are going to continue to create the type of flooding and the stormwater issues. I mentioned some of the great things we have in southeastern Pennsylvania, but with development, you get more runoff, and these storms create more challenges in terms of washed out roads and loss of property damage. So we're going to have to look at it in terms of stormwater, sanitary sewer, as well as roads, bridges, and mass transit. I know we touched on it, if only briefly, on the SEPTA and the transit issues. If you want to have strong suburbs and you want to have access to markets, and you need those service workers to do that type of work that frankly can't be done from home, these folks need access to mass transit. So it all fits together. It's not all free and it's not all easy, but it all needs to be addressed.
Okay. That's interesting. Are there any major projects that haven't started yet that people might be interested in from a infrastructure standpoint? I know you can't talk about the investment that both the state and the feds are putting into this without looking at what is it going to mean for me. And so, the projects are always important. They're always important to folks in the legislature because it's showing their constituents how their money's being spent. I'm just curious if there's anything out there from a statewide perspective that you might want to share with the audience.
One of the one, and maybe it's not statewide, but it's certainly super regional, which is the Schuylkill Valley Metro, which is the idea of reestablishing rail to Reading, which is certainly one of our older third-class cities that needs a little TLC and needs some economic development. The opportunity, frankly, to connect Reading, you mentioned about the economic development and frankly, the things that we have in Philly and the suburbs. And listen, we're not without challenges we need to address, but letting Reading connect itself into that rather than sitting on 422 traffic, that would be good for the whole region. It'd be good for Berks County. We've got a growing population in Reading. We need to give them the economic opportunities that mass transit would bring. That to me is something that should be a priority for the whole region. And again, it's not necessarily helpful for me selfishly where I am in Montgomery County. It's good for the Commonwealth. And I've said that a few times in this conversation. I love the idea, again, super regional. I know they're talking about an I-80 train where Scranton, and God knows our current president would love another train, especially in his boyhood home. But connecting Scranton to the I-80 corridor out of New York and Newark, what that would do for that community and the Monroe counties and everything where we have economic growth. These are areas that are doing well. We need to continue that and incentivize that and give them the tools, which those type of, they're not truly regional rails, but these are lifelines to areas where we have tremendous economic opportunity. I would also say these are areas where we have that legacy housing stock that is still somewhat affordable, where so many other areas have gotten so expensive. These are areas where people can move into livable, walkable communities that are also affordable. And these communities need some TLC. And again, when I go back to that work from home, these are folks who can move into those communities and willing to invest in those communities where they do need a little bit more investment, but the payoff could be huge. But government needs to be a partner in terms of infrastructure investment.
Outstanding. We only have about 5-7 minutes left, and let's finish this by talking about the budget, which is really the main issue before you. Over the next several months is completing a state budget. The governor outlined a very ambitious plan, right? A significant increase in spending from last year. I'm curious what you think about, and budgets are about priorities. So I'm trying to watch how I ask the question. Because it's easy to say, Representative Bradford, what do you think about the governor's plan? Are you gonna, but it is interesting in terms of the proposal. What parts of it are probably easy to get done, and those that probably will take a lot more work or be more difficult to get done? Curious what your thoughts are about that.
Well, I was afraid you were going to say, what are your favorite parts? Because I was going to. That would feel like, which of your 4 children do you love the most? Now, listen, I believe the governor's budget, and I'm obviously biased. We're of the same party, but the governor and I served in the House together. He was our county commissioner, and I'm just very fond of the job he's doing. I think he's a tremendous governor, and I think his poll numbers reflect what a great job he's doing. Listen, if we had a Democratic Senate, frankly, I think even if we had a more moderate Senate, I think his budget would pass almost the way it's written tomorrow. Listen, I think it's a good budget for rural, suburban, and urban Pennsylvania. I think it's a balanced budget. And I don't mean just balanced in terms of dollars, because it is. In fact, I believe you could fully implement his budget and you'd have $11 billion in the bank. Listen, we are flush. We need to make selective, smart investments. The governor proposes that. We also need to continue to put away for that rainy day, and this budget does that. Now, what parts will my Republican friends in the Senate take issue with? Look, our politics are at a place right now where I'd be more shocked if they did what they did last year, which is send the entire governor's budget over as written. But I would argue they should take a hard look at it, because I think they'll find there's a lot of things that are good. You mentioned about how do we bring rural Pennsylvania into the economic growth that we're seeing in the other parts of the Commonwealth. Secretary Siger from DCD talking about site development. Look, those areas where we have huge parcels of land where business can come in relatively inexpensive and bring those type of new high-level manufacturing that we need in those communities, and we have the workforce who can do that type of work in those communities, they should engage that. They should recognize that's not big government. That's an investment in their backyard. It's the same point I try to make on the rural broadband stuff. If these communities are going to connect themselves physically, from a transportation standpoint, and through the technology of our time, they're going to have to engage that. And I don't think they can continue just to feed this is small government. It's not small government. It's a government that doesn't set them up for real strength and growth. My Republican friends represent some of those school districts that I mentioned that we have an obligation to fully fund. If you look at what the governor's budget does in terms of funding for school districts in the Poconos, I was looking at a couple of school districts in Doyle Heffley's district, and what the BFC Commission proposes and what the governor would implement in his budget, what that would do in terms of the competitiveness of those communities, which admittedly have just crushingly high property taxes. Others have paid lip service to the idea of fixing it. This budget would propose to deal with it without raising taxes, could be done in this year is from an incremental standpoint, and puts us on a path over the next 7 years to make a real difference in the economic trajectory of these communities.
Outstanding. I will ask a question about probably one of the more controversial parts of the governor's budget proposal, and that's the recreational use of marijuana. Curious what you think about it. Fairness, it's, I think pretty much every state might have it around us, right? I'm curious, is that a proposal that's DOA, or does it have some possibilities there?
So I think you nailed it with your first point, which is the train has left the station, guys. I think Ohio, West Virginia may be the only one that doesn't. I know, obviously, Delaware, Maryland, New York. I think everyone else. Listen, the state's going to be awash in other states, well-taxed and well-regulated marijuana. Listen, the reality is the issue has been decided by the states and by the voters. Red state conservative Ohio has already passed and moved to adult use. So the decision's been largely made. The question is, do we want the disaster of the illicit market that we already have, or the disaster? And I would argue, the New York experience where they did it very poorly is not something we'd want either. So what I would say is we have the opportunity, much like we did with medical marijuana, to take a thoughtful approach. We've seen what other states have done. We've seen the good, the bad. The governor kind of puts it out there. He doesn't bank a ton of money from it. It's not like this budget requires marijuana revenue, so let's open the floodgates. I think this is a perfect opportunity to have a thoughtful discussion about what this could look like, how it's done smart, thoughtfully, from a safety, from a security standpoint, from making sure it gets where it should and shouldn't get where it shouldn't. So I think it's an opportunity. I appreciate the way the governor has gone about this, and I think there's an opportunity there for us. And again, the decision's being made for us. The question is, how do we want to move forward?
Outstanding. Well, Matt, I appreciate you coming and joining us for just a little bit of time, and we could chat about a variety of different things. It was a lot of fun. I always give my guest the last word. So you're going to speak to obviously employees at Capital Blue Cross, but this will be rebroadcast on PCN multiple times over the next several weeks. So what's the message you want to leave with all of us here today?
Thank you. Thank you for the conversation, and thank you for the thoughtfulness of the questions. Listen, I must say, this is actually, I think some of your questions, and I'm not just playing to my buddy who may be our host. I think the thoughtfulness of the questions actually illuminates some of the challenges. We don't have, and I hope I've said this more than once, because I think it goes to a certain modesty that is missing in our politics. We don't have all the answers, but we have an idea. We have a vision. And I think it's incumbent on the other side, in the other chamber, to have their own vision. What did they want the Commonwealth to look like? We're going to have a very high stakes election in November. And it's going to be largely about the personality of one person and the age of another. We need to start talking about how we grow our economy, how we rebuild our Commonwealth, how we educate our kids, what the future we want for all of our kids. And I say this as a compliment again, Doug, is your questions, I think, actually teased out some of those issues. And I hope my answers are somewhat helpful in terms of saying what we think our priorities need to be. And I think at a time in our Commonwealth and in our politics where they're too poisonous and too partisan, that we at least have begun to have a conversation about what kind of government and what kind of Commonwealth that we want to leave as our legacy.
That's the last word. Ladies and gentlemen, I want to thank Matt Bradford, House Majority Leader, for joining us today on the Public Affairs Forum, sponsored by Capital Blue Cross. Please stay tuned for our next episode next month to be noted shortly. So with that, thank you. Thanks, Matt, for joining us today. This is great.
Thank
It was
you,
a lot of
Doug.
fun. Take care.
The Capital Blue Cross Forum is sponsored in part by Capital Blue Cross.